1957, Plainfield, the butcher's farm, when Hollywood discovered that its nightmares were real. November 16, 1957, Plainfield, Wisconsin. A town so small that its 600 inhabitants knew each other by name, or at least they thought they did. Doors had no locks. Children played without supervision until nightfall. The word monster only existed in the movies they screened on Saturdays at the local cinema. Bernice Worden opened her hardware store every morning at 8 o'clock sharp, a routine she had maintained for 30 years. That Saturday, as snow began to fall gently over Main Street, she prepared her counter like any other day. Her son Frank, deputy chief of police, would stop by later to help her close. A ritual. A certainty in a world of certainties. The doorbell rang around 8:30. Ed Gein entered with his characteristically nervous gait. The shy man from the abandoned farm on the outskirts of town. Always polite. Always with that high-pitched voice that made people underestimate him. The neighbors considered him strange but completely harmless. A loner who did odd jobs and babysat children from the town. What no one in Plainfield knew was that Ed Gein had written Bernice Worden's name in a small notebook that morning. A list. Next to a specific time and an item that wasn't the antifreeze he would request as a pretext. What he had noted down was much more sinister. .22 caliber rifle. When Frank Worden arrived at noon to have lunch with his mother, he found the hardware store empty. The cash register open. A trail of blood snaking toward the back door. And on the counter, the sales book showed the last entry in trembling handwriting. Ed Gein antifreeze. Frank had known Eddie since childhood. The weird kid whose fanatical mother never let him play with others. The teenager who disappeared from the social radar after his brother's suspicious death in a fire. The adult who returned to town only to buy minimal supplies, always evasive, always restless. But Eddie wasn't dangerous. Eddie was just Eddie. Frank immediately called Sheriff Art Schley. Within 30 minutes, 3 patrol cars were heading toward the Gein farm, located 8 kilometers from downtown, at the end of a dirt road that the snow was beginning to cover. The property stood among bare trees that looked like skeletal fingers clawing at Wisconsin's gray sky. The farm looked dead. It had looked dead for years. Officers found Eddie at 6 in the evening at a neighbor's house, dining calmly as if nothing had happened. When asked about Bernice Worden, his response was strangely poetic. "Someone framed her for me." A phrase that made no sense. Yet, Eddie was arrested without resistance. He almost seemed relieved. On the way to the station, he chatted casually about the weather and how he needed to repair his roof before winter. As if he had completely forgotten that a missing woman's name was written in his own handwriting in a bloodstained sales book. Meanwhile, Sheriff Schley and Deputy Worden returned to the Gein farm. It was 8 at night. Darkness had fallen completely over Plainfield. There was no moon. Only the officers' flashlights cut through the absolute blackness enveloping the property. They tried to enter through the front door. Locked. The windows too. Frank Worden suggested checking the side shed where Eddie stored tools and firewood. The door gave way with a strong push. Deputy Worden's beam of light swept the interior. Old boxes. Rusty tools. Piles of wood. Everything seemed normal until the flashlight stopped on something hanging from the ceiling. A body. Upside down. Decapitated. Open from sternum to pubis. Completely drained of blood. Hanging like a deer after a hunt. Frank Worden focused his flashlight toward where the head should be. He recognized the dress. The wristwatch still on the cold wrist. It was his mother. The officer accompanying Frank immediately vomited. Sheriff Schley, a World War II veteran who had seen horrors on European battlefields, remained paralyzed for several seconds before he could articulate a word. But the night of horror was just beginning. Because what they would find when they finally forced entry into the main house 2 hours later would completely redefine American understanding of the nature of human evil. What Ed Gein had been building for more than a decade in complete isolation was unprecedented in America's criminal history. The farm wasn't just a crime scene. It was a nightmare museum. A horror workshop. A shrine dedicated to something so disturbing that the investigators who entered that night would need years of therapy to process what their eyes registered. Ed Gein wasn't just a murderer. He was something completely new. Something for which the American judicial system had no category. Something that Hollywood would take decades to try to understand and that, even so, would never manage to fully replicate on screen. That night, in a small Wisconsin town where everyone thought they knew each other, the world discovered that the most terrifying monsters don't live in Gothic castles or haunted mansions. They live on deteriorated farms. In small towns. Behind shy smiles and high-pitched voices. And for more than 10 years, One of them had been building his own personal hell, piece by piece, body by body, in the absolute silence of rural solitude. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin, second son of George and Augusta Gein. From day one, the Gein family existed under the shadow of a woman with convictions so ironclad that they would shape the tragic destiny of all its members. George Gein was an alcoholic, a weak man who worked sporadically as a carpenter while spending most of his time in local taverns. Augusta openly despised him. To her, her husband represented everything corrupt about the outside world, everything that should be avoided and condemned. Augusta Wilhelmine Lurk was German by birth, Lutheran by faith, fanatical by nature. She believed that all women were instruments of the devil, that all men were condemned to hell, that the entire world was a pit of immorality from which she must protect her children at any cost. In 1914, when Eddie was 8 years old, Augusta sold her small grocery store and bought a completely isolated farm in Plainfield. 195 acres of barren land. No nearby neighbors. No temptations. The perfect place to build her own closed world, away from the corruption she saw in every corner of civilization. The farm was almost 10 kilometers from the nearest town. The access road became impassable during the winter months. Augusta considered it perfect. A kingdom where she would exercise absolute control over every aspect of her children's lives. Eddie and his older brother Henry were homeschooled for years. Every night, Augusta read them the Bible for hours, obsessively focusing on passages about death, sin and eternal damnation. She forbade them from making friends. She forbade them from talking to girls. She forbade them any contact with the outside world that she didn't directly supervise. Augusta's teachings were clear and repetitive. Women were vessels of the devil. All women were whores, all except her. Eddie, small and frail, with a naturally high voice that his mother seemed to prefer, absorbed every word as absolute truth. Henry, older and more skeptical, began to question. But Eddie became the favored son, the pure son, the only truly obedient one. When they were finally forced to attend public school due to legal pressures, Eddie became the target of constant bullying. The other children called him names because of his effeminate voice. They laughed because he smelled bad, because his clothes were dirty, because he didn't understand games or basic social dynamics. Teachers reported that Eddie seemed absent, that he talked to himself, that he had episodes where he simply stared into space with a disturbing smile on his face. Every afternoon, Eddie ran back to the farm, into Augusta's arms. She consoled him with words about how corrupt the outside world was, about how only she could protect him, about how he was special, different, chosen by God. George Gein died of a heart attack in 1940. Augusta didn't cry at the funeral. Eddie was 34 years old and had never had a real conversation with a woman other than his mother. He had never been on a date. He had never questioned the teachings that Augusta had engraved in his mind like divine commandments. Henry, however, began talking about moving out, about getting his own life, about how unhealthy Eddie's relationship with Augusta was. He began verbalizing what he had probably thought for years, that their mother wasn't a saint, but a bitter woman who had destroyed any possibility of a normal life for her sons. Eddie didn't respond to these observations, but something inside him began to fracture. On May 14, 1944, the Gein brothers were burning brush on their property. The fire got out of control. Between the dense smoke and flames, the brothers separated. When Eddie returned to town asking for help, he was hysterical. He screamed that he couldn't find Henry, that he had lost him in the smoke. Volunteer firefighters and neighbors organized an immediate search. Eddie led them directly to his brother's body. Henry lay face up in an area where the fire had barely touched the vegetation. He had visible contusions on his head. There was dried blood in his hair. The coroner determined that the cause of death was asphyxiation from smoke inhalation. No one asked more questions. No one investigated the head wounds. It was Plainfield. Accidents happened. Eddie was the weird but harmless kid. Henry Gein was buried on May 18th. Eddie attended the funeral with his mother. He didn't shed a single tear. For 1 year, Eddie and Augusta lived alone on the increasingly deteriorated farm. Eddie did occasional jobs for neighbors, painting fences, minor repairs, babysitting children. Plainfield residents noticed that Eddie was strange, but considered him reliable. The children adored him because he told them macabre stories about adventures and cannibals that he read in pulp magazines he bought secretly. Augusta's health began to deteriorate. Severe arthritis made her more dependent on Eddie for everything each day. Eddie bathed her, dressed her, fed her, read her the Bible every night. He slept in a small bed next to hers, ready to attend to any need at any hour. On December 29, 1945, Augusta suffered the first of 2 strokes. Eddie cared for her at home, refusing any hospitalization. She was left partially paralyzed. Eddie was by her side every second of every day. On March 8, 1946, a second massive stroke ended Augusta Gein's life. She was 67 years old. Eddie found her body in the bedroom at 6 in the morning. He called the local doctor, but it was too late. At the funeral, Eddie didn't cry. He stood next to the closed casket for hours, staring fixedly at the polished wood, with that disturbing smile that so many remembered from his childhood. Neighbors assumed that Eddie would finally be free, that he would sell the farm, that maybe he would meet someone, that he would build some kind of normal life. They had no idea that Eddie Gein's true life was just about to begin. That night after the funeral, Eddie returned to the empty farm and climbed the stairs to his mother's bedroom. He stood in the doorway for hours, looking at the bed where she had died. The clock on the wall marked 6:15, the exact hour of her death. Eddie stopped it there. Then he began to seal off the room. He nailed boards over the door, sealed the windows with wood and rusty nails, locked the entrance. He did the same with the living room where Augusta read the Bible, with the dining room where they ate together, with every space she had inhabited. Eddie Gein turned the farm into a mausoleum for his mother. Augusta's rooms would remain exactly as they were the day of her death, untouched, sacred, preserved forever. He only inhabited 2 spaces, the dirty kitchen where he prepared basic meals, and a small adjacent bedroom where he slept on a mattress directly on the floor. The rest of the house became a sealed sanctuary. Electricity was cut off in 1947 for non-payment. Eddie didn't bother to reconnect it. He lived with kerosene lamps and candles, in almost perpetual darkness. Neighbors saw him occasionally in town buying minimal supplies. Always polite. Always with his head down. No one suspected that something sinister was brewing on that deteriorated farm. Because in the lonely nights of 1947, Eddie Gein began visiting the Plainfield cemetery. Initially he just sat by his mother's grave for hours, talking to the headstone as if Augusta could hear him. But the visits became more frequent, and much darker. The first months after Augusta's death, Eddie Gein became a ghost in his own town. Neighbors saw him occasionally buying bread, milk, canned goods. He always paid in cash from the sporadic jobs he managed to get. He always kept conversations minimal. He always disappeared quickly back toward his isolated farm. The property deteriorated visibly. The roof developed leaks that Eddie never repaired. Windows broke and remained that way. Weeds grew wildly around the structure. But Eddie didn't seem to notice or care. He only worried about keeping his mother's rooms sealed and continuing with his new nocturnal routine. In December 1947, Eddie began carrying tools to the Plainfield cemetery. A shovel, a pickaxe. He hid them among the bushes near the entrance. He waited until after midnight, when the town slept completely, when not even the stray dogs barked in the empty streets. The first grave Eddie Gein desecrated belonged to a recently buried woman. Eleanor Adams had died of pneumonia at 63. Her funeral had been held just 3 days before. The earth over her coffin was still loose, relatively easy to dig in Wisconsin's winter cold. Eddie worked for 4 hours that night. Snow fell lightly, muffling any sound of the shovel hitting the frozen earth. His hands bled from the effort and the cutting cold, but he continued digging deeper and deeper until he reached the cheap wood of the coffin. He opened it with a rusty crowbar he had brought specifically for that purpose. Eleanor Adams lay there dressed in her best Sunday clothes, hands crossed over her chest. Decomposition had barely begun in the sub-zero temperatures. Eddie observed her for a long time under the dim light of a small flashlight. Then, with almost reverent movements, he began taking specific parts of her. Not the entire body. Only carefully selected pieces. He closed the coffin again, refilled the grave, scattered the excess dirt among the surrounding bushes. When he finished, near dawn, the grave looked completely intact. No one would notice anything until spring, when the grass would grow unevenly over the area. Eddie returned to his farm with a burlap sack. In the kitchen, illuminated only by trembling candles, he placed his treasure on the stained table. He observed it for hours, touched the cold skin, spoke to it as if it were alive, as if it could hear him, as if it were company in his absolute solitude. Thus began what Eddie would later describe as his collection. Over the next 2 years, Eddie visited the Plainfield cemetery at least 9 times that he could later document with disturbing precision. Each time he chose graves of women who had died recently. middle-aged or older women. Women who, according to his distorted perception, resembled Augusta. The names would be written in his personal diaries, discovered years later by investigators. Eleanor Adams, Mabel Everson, Irene Hill, and 6 others whose names Eddie remembered with disturbing clarity during subsequent interrogations. His memory for these details was perfect. He could recite exact dates, weather conditions, even the color of the dresses they had been buried in. But Eddie didn't only exhume complete bodies. Sometimes he took only specific parts. A head from one grave, skin from another, internal organs from a third body. He was selective, methodical, almost artistic in his macabre approach. In his nauseating kitchen, Eddie began transforming these human remains into objects. Masks made with complete facial skin that he preserved using salt and rudimentary tanning techniques he had learned by reading taxidermy manuals. Lampshades constructed with human skin stretched over wire structures that allowed light to pass through in a grotesquely translucent way. Belts decorated with anatomical pieces sewn in a row. Boxes lined with skin fragments. Eddie kept skulls as functional containers. He used long bones as legs for improvised furniture. He converted body parts into decorative elements for his increasingly disturbing kitchen. The most unsettling object Eddie would create over time was what he called his woman's suit. A complete vest made of meticulously sewn human torsos, with real female anatomy still intact. Leg coverings made from tanned human skin. A complete facial mask with real hair still attached to the preserved scalp. Eddie would put on this suit. He would look at himself in the broken mirror of his kitchen under the yellowish light of candles. And he would dance in the darkness of his isolated farm, genuinely believing that somehow he had brought Augusta back. That he had become her. That he would never have to be alone again. During the day, Eddie functioned with disconcerting normality. He did occasional jobs for local farmers. He helped elderly ladies with household repairs. He babysat children from the town who adored him for the macabre stories he told about adventures and monsters. Bob Hill regularly hired Eddie as a babysitter for his 2 young children. The children visited Eddie's farm during the day, fascinated by the anatomy books he had scattered in the kitchen. Eddie talked to them about scientific experiments he supposedly did with dead animals. The children thought Eddie was the most interesting adult in town. No one ever entered the sealed rooms. Eddie made sure of that with almost paranoid vigilance. In 1948, Eddie added a new element to his nocturnal routine, watching women from the town through their windows. He would hide among bushes for hours, studying how they moved, how they undressed, how they lived their private lives without knowing they were being observed. He took detailed mental notes, memorized patterns. When any of these women died of natural causes and was buried in the Plainfield cemetery, Eddie knew exactly where to find them. Town residents began noticing small inexplicable anomalies. Objects that disappeared without apparent reason. A lamp that never appeared. A chair that vanished from a basement. Women's clothing stolen from clotheslines on moonless nights. No one connected these isolated incidents. They were minor mysteries in a town where locks were practically decorative and mutual trust was absolute. Mary Hogan represented a fundamental change in Eddie's pattern. Mary ran a tavern in Pine Grove, a neighboring town 10 kilometers from Plainfield. She was 51 years old. She was corpulent, loud-voiced, completely independent. She lived alone in an apartment above her establishment. According to Eddie's standards, she resembled Augusta in physical constitution and approximate age. On December 8, 1954, a Saturday afternoon, Mary Hogan simply disappeared. A regular customer arrived at 4 o'clock and found the tavern completely empty. The front door was open, the lights on, the radio playing country music. But Mary wasn't there. There was a trail of blood running from behind the bar to the back door. A .22 caliber bullet casing gleamed on the wooden floor. The cash register was intact. There were no signs of robbery. Only blood and silence. Local police investigated with the limited resources of a rural department from the 1950s. They interrogated Mary's acquaintances, reviewed her personal finances, searched the surrounding forest for days, dragged a nearby lake. They never found the body. They never found conclusive evidence about what had happened exactly. Mary Hogan's case was filed as a missing person, possibly murdered. Theories ranged from a vagrant to a disgruntled customer. No one mentioned Ed Gein. Why would they? Eddie was the weird but completely harmless man who babysat children and helped elderly women with their shopping. But in Eddie's kitchen, among the shadows cast by candles dripping wax onto grimy surfaces, a new mask hung from a rusty hook on the wall. It was Mary Hogan's complete face. meticulously tanned, preserved with techniques Eddie had perfected over years, with the hair still attached. Eddie looked at it every night before trying to sleep on his dirty mattress. He talked to it as if it could respond. He considered it part of his growing family of silent companions who never judged him, never abandoned him, never questioned his devotion to Augusta's memory. 3 years after Mary Hogan's disappearance, Eddie Gein continued his dual existence with mechanical precision. During the day, the peculiar but reliable man that everyone in Plainfield knew superficially. During the night, the grave robber, the horror artisan, the devoted son who had found a grotesque way to never be truly alone. The farm sank deeper into deterioration with each passing season. The winter of 1957 was particularly brutal. Snow accumulated against the exterior walls. The icy wind whistled through the broken windows. But Eddie barely noticed the cold. He was too busy perfecting his collection, too absorbed in his private world where the line between the living and the dead had blurred until becoming completely irrelevant. In November 1957, Eddie Gein was 51 years old. He had spent more than a decade perfecting his macabre skills. He had desecrated at least 9 documented graves. He had killed Mary Hogan, although he would take time to admit it explicitly. His house was a nightmare museum that no criminal investigator in America had ever seen. And he was about to make the mistake that would expose his entire secret world to the brutal light of national attention. Bernice Worden had become his new obsession. Eddie visited her at her hardware store with increasingly transparent excuses, buying unnecessary items just to be near her. Bernice was 58 years old, gray hair, robust build. In Eddie's distorted mind, she was almost a perfect duplicate of Augusta. Eddie planned November 16th with the same methodical care he applied to everything in his nocturnal life. He knew Bernice would be alone that morning. He knew exactly what he needed. And this time, Eddie Gein had decided not to wait for nature to do its work. This time he would create his own opportunity. The morning of November 16th, 1957 dawned cold and gray over Plainfield. Eddie Gein woke before dawn as he always did. He prepared weak coffee in his candlelit kitchen. He reviewed his plan mentally over and over. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to go exactly as he had imagined. He arrived at Bernice Worden's hardware store around 8:30. The bell above the door announced his entrance. Bernice looked up from her account book and greeted him with professional courtesy. Eddie mumbled something about needing antifreeze. His high voice trembled slightly. Bernice noted the order while Eddie disappeared among the aisles. What happened in the next few minutes would be partially reconstructed by forensic evidence. Eddie took a .22 caliber rifle from one of the display shelves. Bernice probably heard the metallic sound of the rifle being loaded. Maybe she turned around. Maybe she had time to see Eddie pointing it at her. A single shot, direct to the head. Bernice Worden fell behind the counter without even time to scream. Eddie worked quickly after that. He locked the front door from inside, turned off some lights, dragged Bernice's body toward his truck parked in the back alley. He covered her with an old tarp he had brought prepared specifically for this purpose. But Eddie Gein, so meticulous in so many aspects of his nocturnal life, made a critical mistake in his haste. He left the sales book open on the counter. His name written in his own trembling handwriting, Eddie Gein Antifreeze. When Frank Worden arrived at noon and found the hardware store empty, when he saw the blood snaking toward the back door, when he read that name in the sales book, he immediately knew that something terrible had occurred. He called Sheriff Schley. Patrol cars headed toward the Gein farm while other officers searched for Eddie in town. They found Eddie at 6 in the evening at a neighbor's house, dining calmly as if nothing extraordinary had happened. When asked about Bernice Worden, his response was strange and poetic. "Someone framed her for me." A phrase that made no logical sense but would reveal its horrible meaning in the following hours. Eddie was arrested without resistance. He seemed almost relieved to finally be discovered. On the way to the station, he chatted about trivial topics with a disconcerting calm that deeply unsettled the officers. Meanwhile, Sheriff Schley and Deputy Worden arrived at the Gein farm when darkness had already fallen completely over Wisconsin. There was no electricity. The property was plunged in total blackness. Their flashlights were the only sources of light as they approached the deteriorated structure. The front door was locked. The windows too. Frank Worden suggested checking the side shed. The door gave way with a strong push. The interior smelled of dampness, rotted wood and something else. Something metallic and organic that neither officer could immediately identify. Deputy Worden's beam of light slowly swept the space. Stacked boxes. Tools hanging from rusty hooks. piles of firewood against a wall. Everything seemed relatively normal until the flashlight stopped on something hanging from the ceiling by a thick rope. A human body, suspended upside down, decapitated, open from sternum to pubis in a perfectly vertical incision. The viscera had been removed with surgical precision, completely drained of blood, hanging exactly like a deer after being hunted and processed to preserve the meat. Frank Wardens moved his flashlight upward, instinctively searching for where the head should be. There was no head, only the body suspended in that grotesque position. But he recognized the dress, the wristwatch still on the cold wrist. His mother had been turned into a piece of game. The officer accompanying Frank ran outside and vomited violently among the bushes. Sheriff Schley, who had served in World War II and had walked among corpses on European battlefields, remained completely motionless for several seconds. His mind refused to fully process what his eyes were registering. They called for reinforcements immediately. Forensic photographers, the county coroner, more officers. They needed light. They needed equipment. They needed to prepare themselves mentally for what they sensed they would find when they finally entered the main house. 2 hours later, with portable generators illuminating the scene and a dozen officers present, they forced entry into Ed Gein's kitchen. The smell hit them first. A nauseating mixture of decomposition, dampness, rancid grease and something sickly sweet that several officers would later identify as the smell of improperly tanned skin. The light from flashlights and generators revealed a scene that redefined collective understanding about the limits of human horror. The kitchen was the epicenter of more than a decade of macabre work. Surfaces were covered with accumulated grime. Dirty dishes piled in the sink contained remains that subsequent forensic analysis would identify as human tissue. At the table, for chairs with seats that looked like old leather but turned out to be meticulously tanned and braided human skin. Hanging from the ceiling, several lampshades made with human skin stretched over wire frames. When officers shone their flashlights behind them, light passed through the translucent skin revealing veins and capillaries still visible in the biological material. On the kitchen wall, masks. 10 complete human faces, tanned and preserved with rudimentary but effective techniques. Some retained real hair still attached to the scalp. One of them was later identified as Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who had disappeared 3 years earlier. Her face had been removed with surgical precision and transformed into a mask that Eddie could wear. Sheriff Schley opened a cupboard with trembling hands. Inside, hanging from butcher hooks like clothes in a wardrobe, were vests constructed with complete human torsos. Female anatomy remained intact, sewn with thick thread in patterns that showed a disturbing dedication to detail. A younger officer opened shoeboxes stacked on improvised shelves. Inside he found human organs preserved in salt. Anatomical parts cut and stored meticulously. Each box labeled with dates and names written in Eddie's trembling handwriting. There were containers made from human skulls sawed in half and polished until they shone. Eddie used them functionally to eat soup and store small objects. Decorative belts constructed with human skin. Knife sheaths made with facial skin where eye sockets formed decorative openings. An improvised drum constructed with human skin stretched over a wooden frame. Boxes lined with fragments of tattooed skin. Necklaces made with human body parts strung on fishing line. The refrigerator that ran on kerosene contained human organs in preserving jars, carefully labeled with names and dates going back to 1947. Eleanor Adams, Mabel Everson, Irene Hill. Names that officers recognized as deceased Plainfield residents whose funerals had been normal community events. But the most disturbing discovery was stored in a wooden box under Eddie's bed in his small bedroom. The complete suit that Eddie had mentioned cryptically in his initial confession. A vest made with real female torso, tanned and sewn to be worn. Leg coverings made from human skin. A complete facial mask with curly gray hair still attached, preserved with homemade chemicals Eddie had learned to mix by reading taxidermy manuals. Ed Gein literally dressed in the skin of dead women. He physically transformed himself into what he believed was his mother. He danced in his candlelit kitchen, genuinely believing he had found a way to bring Augusta back to life. Investigators worked for 3 complete days cataloging everything on the Gein farm. Photographers documented every object, every corner, every detail of this nightmare museum. Experienced officers needed to take frequent breaks, stepping out into Wisconsin's cold air to vomit or simply breathe air that wasn't contaminated with the smell of death and decomposition. The sealed rooms remained exactly as they had been the day Augusta died in 1946. 11 years without being touched. The clock on her bedroom wall marked 6:15, the exact hour of her death. Her clothes hung neatly in the closet. Her religious books were open to the pages she had been reading. Eddie had preserved these spaces as sacred shrines while transforming the rest of the house into a horror workshop. The news exploded in the national press like a bomb. On November 18, 1957, all major newspapers in the country carried the story on the front page. The case dominated news cycles for weeks. Journalists from all over the United States invaded Plainfield. Photographers camped in front of the farm. Morbid curiosity seekers traveled hundreds of miles just to see the place where these horrors had occurred. Headlines competed to capture the magnitude of the horror: House of Horrors in Wisconsin. The Butcher of Plainfield. Farmer turned corpses into decoration. Words struggled to describe something that exceeded normal human experience. Eddie Gein was nicknamed the Plainfield Ghoul. The term ghoul, coming from Arabic folklore referring to demons that desecrate graves and eat human flesh, entered common American vocabulary to describe Eddie. Plainfield residents plunged into deep collective trauma. Parents who had allowed Eddie to babysit their children needed prescribed sedatives. Bob Hill, who had regularly hired Eddie as a babysitter for years, was hospitalized for a severe nervous breakdown. The idea that they had left their children alone with Eddie on that farm, surrounded by objects made with human remains, was unbearable. Women whom Eddie had helped with household repairs felt retroactively violated. They showered compulsively, trying to wash away the sensation of his presence. Several needed psychological therapy for years. The entire town faced an impossible question. How had they lived for more than a decade alongside such a monster without noticing? How had they trusted him? How had they allowed him into their homes, to touch their belongings, to interact with their families? On November 22, just 6 days after Eddie's arrest, a mysterious fire completely destroyed the Gein farm. Flames consumed the structure in less than 2 hours. Firefighters who responded didn't make particularly heroic efforts to save the building. The origin of the fire was never officially determined, but everyone in Plainfield knew that someone from the town had decided that the House of Horror simply couldn't continue to exist. 25,000 people visited the smoldering ruins during the following days. Morbid tourists, journalists looking for new angles, curious people who needed to see with their own eyes the place where the unthinkable had occurred. Plainfield became synonymous with American horror. Eddie remained in custody, subjected to exhaustive psychiatric evaluations. He confessed to having desecrated between 9 and 12 graves with disturbing precision about dates and names. He confessed to having murdered Bernice Worden. He would eventually admit to having killed Mary Hogan 3 years earlier, although initially he was evasive about that specific crime. About other disappearances in the region, Eddie remained ambiguous. There were at least 5 women who had disappeared without resolution within a 50-kilometer radius during those 11 years. Eddie only smiled that disturbing smile when asked. Maybe. I don't remember well. Possibly. The psychiatrists evaluating him were simultaneously fascinated and horrified. Eddie spoke about his mother with absolute devotion. About how she was the only pure woman who had existed. About how all other women were corrupt except those who resembled Augusta. About how he had found a way to never be alone again. Eddie showed no genuine remorse. He didn't understand why people were so upset. In his distorted mind, he had been honoring his mother. He had been creating beauty. He had been solving the problem of his loneliness in the only way that made sense to him. The psychiatric evaluation concluded what was already obvious. Eddie Gein was completely insane. His connection to reality had been severely damaged decades earlier by Augusta's psychological abuse. He lived in a world where the boundaries between living and dead, between human and object, between love and horror, had blurred until becoming completely irrelevant. Plainfield would desperately try to forget. It would try to rebuild its image as a normal and safe town. But the name would remain permanently associated with Eddie Gein, with the House of Horror, with the discovery that had forced America to confront a terrible truth about human nature. Monsters don't live in gothic castles or haunted mansions from horror movies. They live in small towns, on deteriorated farms, behind shy smiles and high-pitched voices. And they can exist for decades in complete isolation, building their own nightmare worlds, without anyone suspecting absolutely anything. The Wisconsin judicial system had never faced a case like Edward Gein's. Prosecutors from Waushara County found themselves with an unprecedented legal dilemma. How to prosecute a man whose sanity was clearly in question but whose crimes were so atrocious that they demanded justice. On November 21, 1957, 5 days after his arrest, Eddie Gein was formally charged with the murder of Bernice Worden. The charge for Mary Hogan's murder would come later, Once authorities could build a solid case based on circumstantial evidence and the facial mask found in his kitchen. Eddie was transferred to Central State Hospital in Waupun, Wisconsin, for complete psychiatric evaluation. During the following weeks, a team of psychiatrists attempted to unravel the mind of a man who had existed in a state of functional psychosis for more than a decade. Dr. E.F. Schubert, the principal psychiatrist assigned to the case, spent hours interviewing Eddie in a sterile hospital room. Eddie spoke freely, almost with childlike enthusiasm, about his life, his mother, his nocturnal activities. He showed no shame. He demonstrated no real understanding of why his actions were considered monstrous. Eddie described Augusta as a saint, as the only pure woman in a corrupt world. He explained how after her death, loneliness had become unbearable, how he had begun visiting the cemetery simply to feel close to her, how the idea of taking parts of buried bodies emerged gradually as a logical solution to his absolute isolation. Not living company which would be corrupt like all women except Augusta, but silent company. Company that would never judge him. Company that he could literally mold to resemble his mother. Eddie explained the process of creating his objects with technical pride. He had studied taxidermy books from the town library. He had experimented with different tanning methods using salt, homemade chemicals, time and patience. He had perfected his techniques over years until achieving disturbing effectiveness in preserving human skin. The woman's suit wasn't sexual perversion according to Eddie. It was literal transformation. When he put on that skin, he genuinely believed he became his mother. That Augusta hadn't really died. That he had found a way to keep her alive by physically fusing with the essence of women who resembled her. Dr. Schubert took meticulous notes while Eddie spoke. The dissociation from reality was profound and apparently irreversible. Eddie didn't live in the same moral universe as the rest of humanity. Basic categories of right and wrong, appropriate and inappropriate, living and dead, simply didn't function in his mind as they did in normally developed brains. On January 6, 1958, after weeks of exhaustive evaluation, Dr. Schubert presented his official report. Edward Gein suffered from severe schizophrenia. He lived in a state of chronic psychosis. He was not competent to stand trial. He didn't understand the nature of the charges against him. He couldn't adequately assist in his own defense because his understanding of reality was fundamentally fragmented. The recommendation was clear. Eddie Gein should be institutionalized indefinitely in a maximum security psychiatric hospital until he could be considered competent for trial. Judge Herbert A. Bund accepted the psychiatric evaluation. On January 7, 1958, Eddie Gein was officially declared incompetent to stand trial and was transferred to Central State Hospital for indefinite treatment and custody. The decision generated immediate controversy. Plainfield residents wanted to see Eddie executed. They wanted traditional justice for Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. They wanted him to pay for having desecrated the graves of their loved ones. The idea that Eddie would simply be sent to a hospital, where he would receive medical treatment instead of punishment, was unbearable for many. But the American legal system, even in 1958, recognized that genuine insanity was a mitigating factor. Eddie Gein wasn't a calculating criminal who had consciously chosen evil. He was a man whose mind had been systematically destroyed over decades by severe psychological abuse, extreme isolation and untreated mental illness. At Central State Hospital, Eddie became a model patient. Obedient, cooperative with staff. He participated in occupational therapies. He read books they provided him. He never caused problems. Several staff members described him as kind, even charming in his shy and childlike manner. But therapies couldn't reverse decades of psychological damage. The antipsychotic medications of the era were rudimentary and ineffective for such severe cases. Eddie continued believing that his actions had been appropriate, that he had been honoring his mother, that the world simply didn't understand what he had been trying to achieve. For 10 years, Eddie remained institutionalized while lawyers debated whether he would ever be competent to stand trial. Psychiatrists produced periodic evaluations. Some suggested marginal improvements. Others indicated that the basic psychosis remained intact. In 1968, 20 years after his initial arrest, the Wisconsin Supreme Court finally determined that Eddie Gein was sufficiently competent to stand trial. Not because he was cured, but because he had developed enough superficial understanding of legal procedures to participate formally. On November 7, 1968, Edward Gein's trial for the murder of Bernice Worden began in the Waushara County Courthouse. Eddie, now 62 years old, sat quietly at the defense table. His hair had turned completely white. His face showed the deep lines of decades of institutionalization. The trial lasted barely a week. The evidence was overwhelming and indisputable. The trail of blood in the hardware store. Bernice's body found in Eddie's shed. The objects made with human remains. Eddie's detailed confession about exactly how he had killed Bernice and processed her body. The defense didn't argue innocence. They argued insanity. Eddie's lawyers presented the same psychiatric evidence that had been compiled over a decade. Expert testimonies described the severe schizophrenia, the extreme childhood abuse, the psychotic dissociation from reality. The prosecutor presented the case that Eddie had been functional enough to plan his crimes, that he had successfully hidden his activities for years, that he had shown premeditation and awareness that what he did was socially unacceptable, evidenced by his secrecy. On November 14, 1968, after deliberating for less than an hour, the jury returned with their verdict. Edward Gein was declared guilty of first-degree murder of Bernice Worden. Immediately afterward, the same jury had to determine whether Eddie was legally insane at the time of the crime. This was a crucial technical distinction in American criminal law. Guilty of the act, but potentially not criminally responsible due to mental illness. Psychiatrists testified again. They described how Eddie's capacity to distinguish between right and wrong had been destroyed by decades of abuse and progressive mental illness. How he lived in a completely different moral universe where his actions made logical sense within his distorted belief system. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Their decision was unanimous. Edward Gein had been legally insane at the time of Bernice Worden's murder. He was guilty of the physical act but not criminally responsible due to mental illness. The sentence was immediate, indefinite institutionalization at Central State Hospital. Eddie would be confined in a maximum security psychiatric institution for the rest of his natural life. Not prison. Not execution. Hospital. Bernice Worden's relatives left the courthouse with expressions of deep bitterness. Frank Worden, who had dedicated 11 years of his life waiting to see Eddie face traditional justice, gave a brief statement to journalists gathered on the courthouse steps. There was no satisfaction in this outcome. His mother was still dead. The monster who had killed her would live in relative comfort in a hospital instead of facing real consequences. But at least Eddie Gein would never walk free again. At least that was something. Eddie was transferred back to Central State Hospital immediately after the trial. He would live there for the next 16 years, slowly aging in a small room with bars on the windows, surrounded by other patients with minds fractured in diverse ways. He never expressed genuine remorse. He never seemed to fully understand why the world saw him as a monster instead of as a devoted son who had found a creative solution to his unbearable loneliness. The psychiatrist who treated him during those years described Eddie as a frustrating enigma. He functioned normally in many aspects. He could maintain coherent conversations about everyday topics. He read newspapers. He followed sporting events. He played cards with other patients. But when asked about his mother, about the graves, about the objects he had created, Eddie slipped back into that psychotic space where normal categories of reality simply didn't apply. Where death wasn't permanent. Where human skin was artistic material. Where literally becoming another person using their flesh was an expression of love and devotion. The Edward Gein case generated significant changes in how Wisconsin handled both cemeteries and community mental health. New regulations for cemetery security were implemented. Outreach programs were established for isolated individuals who might be developing untreated mental illnesses. But these systemic changes couldn't undo the trauma that Eddie had inflicted on Plainfield. The town desperately tried to reclaim its previous identity as a quiet and normal community. Residents avoided mentioning Eddie in conversations. Children who had been babysat by him grew up with the psychological weight of knowing they had been in the presence of such a monster during their most vulnerable years. Bob Hill, the man who had regularly hired Eddie as a babysitter, never fully recovered. He drank more than was healthy. He had recurring nightmares about his children playing on Eddie's farm, surrounded by objects made with human remains without knowing it. He died in 1973 of cirrhosis at 56 years old. His family always believed that Eddie Gein had killed him slowly, though indirectly. Plainfield struggled with its toxic legacy. Morbid tourists continued visiting for years. They searched for the location of the destroyed farm. They took photographs next to the town sign. They asked insensitive questions to local residents who only wanted to forget. The name Edward Gein became synonymous with a particular type of horror. The monster hidden in plain sight, the reliable neighbor who turns out to be something completely different in private, the superficial normality that conceals profound psychopathology. And while Eddie aged quietly in his hospital room, reading his books and participating in supervised recreational activities, America was beginning to discover that his story didn't end with his institutionalization. Because Eddie Gein had done something that no criminal before him had achieved. He had permanently infiltrated the American cultural unconscious. He had provided the template for a new generation of fictional monsters that would dominate horror cinema for decades. Hollywood had been paying attention. Edward Gein died on July 26, 1984 at Mendota State Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. He was 77 years old. The official cause was respiratory failure related to cancer. He had spent 26 years institutionalized, more than a third of his entire life. His death was national news. Newspapers that had covered his arrest in 1957 now published obituaries summarizing a life that had redefined American horror. Eddie Gein, the Plainfield ghoul, had finally ceased to exist physically. But his legacy was only beginning to fully manifest. Eddie's funeral was a small, private affair. Only a handful of people attended. There was no formal religious service. His body was buried in the Plainfield Cemetery, ironically the same cemetery he had systematically desecrated decades earlier. His headstone was placed next to his mother Augusta's. Even in death, Eddie remained beside the woman who had destroyed his mind and defined every aspect of his grotesque existence. Eddie's grave immediately became a destination for morbid tourists. People traveled from all over the country to photograph the headstone. Some left strange objects as grotesque tributes. The headstone was stolen in the year 2000, probably by macabre collectors. It was never recovered or replaced. Plainfield could finally try to close that dark chapter of its history. But Eddie Gein's impact extended far beyond that small Wisconsin town. Because while Eddie lived his final years in quiet institutionalization, Hollywood had been transforming his story into something completely new. In 1960, director Alfred Hitchcock released Psycho. The film told the story of Norman Bates, a shy man who ran an isolated motel and had an obsessive relationship with his dead mother. Norman preserved his mother's corpse. He dressed in her clothes. He adopted her personality. He murdered women who resembled her. The inspiration was undeniable. Robert Bloch, the author of the novel on which the film was based, had lived only 65 kilometers from Plainfield when Eddie was arrested. He had read the newspaper reports. He had followed the case obsessively. Norman Bates was Eddie Gein filtered through cinematic narrative. Psycho revolutionized horror cinema. It introduced the idea that the most terrifying monsters weren't supernatural creatures but humans with deeply fractured minds. People who could appear superficially normal but who concealed devastating psychopathology. In 1974, Tobe Hooper released the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The film featured Leatherface, a killer who wore masks made from human skin and transformed victims into decorative objects. The connection to Eddie Gein was explicit. Hooper had publicly stated that Eddie's story had inspired him to create one of the most influential horror films of all time. In 1991, Jonathan Demme directed The Silence of the Lambs. The film featured Buffalo Bill, a serial killer who kidnapped women and removed their skin to create a female suit he could wear. Literally, Eddie Gein's suit transformed into contemporary cinematic narrative. Eddie Gein had become the template, the original archetype, the real monster who inspired generations of fictional monsters. Norman Bates, Leatherface, Buffalo Bill. All were variations of the same theme, the isolated man with a toxic relationship with his mother who transforms human corpses into objects. The Netflix series released in October 2025, Monster, the Ed Gein story starring Charlie Hunnam, represented Hollywood's most recent attempt to understand and portray Eddie. The series explored not only his crimes but his massive cultural impact. How a lonely Wisconsin farmer had involuntarily become the founding father of modern psychological horror. The series was controversial. Critics debated whether it was appropriate to glamorize or dramatize such atrocious crimes. Victims' families expressed frustration that the story continued to be exploited decades later. But the cultural fascination with Eddie Gein remained unshakable. Because Eddie's story raised questions that American society still struggles to answer. Are monsters born or created? Would Eddie have been different with a different mother, with early intervention for his mental illness, with healthy social connections? The psychiatrists who studied his case for decades concluded that Eddie represented a perfect storm of factors. Genetic predisposition to schizophrenia, severe psychological abuse during critical formative years, extreme social isolation, completely untreated mental illness, and unlimited access to do the unthinkable without supervision. Changing any of those factors could have resulted in a completely different Eddie Gein. A weird but functional man. A harmless loner. Someone neighbors would vaguely remember as the quiet guy who never caused trouble. But all those factors converged in Plainfield, Wisconsin in the first half of the 20th century, and produced something America had never seen before and hoped never to see again. The graves Eddie desecrated in the Plainfield Cemetery were restored when possible. The families of Eleanor Adams, Mabel Everson, Irene Hill, and the other victims received some type of closure when investigations confirmed that their loved ones had been disturbed. But that knowledge brought its own trauma. Knowing that the bodies of their mothers, sisters, aunts had been transformed into grotesque objects by a man who lived kilometers away. Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden never received true justice. Eddie admitted their murders but never faced traditional punishment. Their families lived with the bitterness of knowing that the man who had killed their loved ones spent the rest of his life in relative comfort in psychiatric hospitals. The unanswered questions remain. Were there other victims who were never discovered? Eddie was ambiguous about several disappearances in the region during those 11 years. Some police investigations were never satisfactorily resolved. Had Eddie murdered more women besides Mary and Bernice? Or had he really limited himself primarily to desecrating graves? Eddie died taking those secrets with him. He never provided complete confessions about all his activities. Investigators suspected there was more, but without physical evidence or confession, the cases remained open and unresolved. Plainfield finally removed all physical markers related to Eddie Gein. The location of his destroyed farm is now just an empty field. There are no commemorative plaques. No signs. Current residents, many of whom were born decades after the crimes, try to live normal lives without the constant shadow of their town's darkest history. But the name Plainfield remains associated with Eddie Gein. A quick internet search instantly connects the town with the monster. Morbid tourism has decreased but has never completely disappeared. Every few years, a new documentary or movie or television series reignites public interest. The farm where Eddie built his nightmare museum no longer physically exists, but it exists permanently in the American cultural unconscious. In every horror film featuring a killer with mother issues. In every psychological thriller about the monster hidden behind superficial normality. In every story that explores how isolation and madness can transform a human into something completely different. Eddie Gein lived 51 years before being discovered. For more than a decade, he built his private world of horror in complete silence. No one suspected. No one intervened. No one saved potential victims because no one knew there were victims at all. That is perhaps the most terrifying lesson of the Eddie Gein case. Not that monsters exist, because humanity has always known that. But that monsters can live among us for years, decades, entire lifetimes without being detected. They can be the quiet neighbor, the reliable caretaker, the shy man who helps with repairs. They can be completely invisible until the moment they make the mistake that exposes their entire secret world. And when that world is finally revealed, when flashlights finally illuminate what has been occurring in the darkness, the truth can be so devastating that it completely redefines our understanding of the limits of human horror. Eddie Gein died in 1984. But the question his life poses remains alive. How many other Eddie Geins exist right now in small towns on isolated farms, building their own nightmare worlds in absolute secrecy? It's a question no one wants to answer. But it's a question that Eddie Gein's story forces us to confront.